So the common denominator of all the researchers present here, they're all practitioners of meditation. And this experience nurtures their work and it's given them the curiosity to go and see what happens. And then there's neuroimaging, and we can determine what is the effect of mindfulness on the brain, on the neuroplasticity of the brain, and how meditation can create a well-being and help the brain to age properly, and it also whether it can prevent Alzheimer. And if meditate influences the expression of our genes, how can meditation allow us to cultivate our attention span? Antoine, Lutz, we'll start with you. You were director of research at INSERM, and you had your thesis with Francisco Varela. You studied in the United States with David Richardson, and you come back to Lyon to determine the impact of meditation, of mindfulness on the brain. You have different research themes, the impact that meditation has on pain, and what are the effects of compassion, awareness, mindfulness through meditation. You have the floor, Antoine.
Thank you, Caroline. Hello to everyone. I would like to share some studies with you, studies that we carried out over the last few years. It's about the impact of meditation on emotions and attention. I'm going to focus on some research work that may enable you to establish this link between what we discussed yesterday with the meditation teachers and guests we had and the empirical work we carry out in laboratories. There is an abyss between the two, I must say, but I would really like to make you aware, or at least show to you, how scientists try to establish that bridge between the experience we personally have in meditation and neurophysical activity. This is something I prepared this morning. There may be a few slides missing. This is a longitudinal study that was carried out in Northern America some years ago near Boston in a monastery, in a Vipassana monastery, where we studied the effect of attention before and after 3 months of meditation. This illustrates one of the mechanisms broached yesterday, i.e. the quality of the attention in meditation. As was explained to you yesterday, what matters in meditation is not the attention about an object, it's the quality of that attention. How can you capture this in a laboratory? This was a collaborative trial with Dr. Slachter and David Richardson. We focused on attention cleavage. Very briefly, you can see that we present letters. In between, there are two figures that you have to detect, T1, T2. According to this literature, when this span is short between the two times, you can observe both 30 milliseconds when it's very, very short. Frequently, you'll see the first one but miss the second one. Why? Because we believe it reflects attentional capture, the fact that attention is pleased to see the first one, therefore focuses on the first one, and you can no longer perceive the second one. So sensorial data do no longer reach your attention. So we wondered how meditation training could enable you to better allocate your attentional resources with more flexibility. So after 3 months of intensive meditation, we observed that there was this attentional capture And this is what we saw and is reflected on the diagram. After 3 months of intensive meditation, compared to a control group, it was easier to capture the second time or point. Now, this was a system of mobile ECG, and we measured these attentional processes and detected that there are less attentional resources used in the way in which we process sensorial information after 3 months of intense meditation. And that has an impact on your attention. So for the first time, we managed to show that intensive meditation training could increase your attention performance. And this enables you to illustrate the specific attitude, the non-reactive presence that is cultivated and nurtured in meditation. In other words, thanks to neuroimaging, you can actually measure attention. You have a trace of this activity, of the attentional quality that is nurtured in meditation. Why cultivate this? It is interesting in order to regulate emotions. There's pioneering work carried out by John Kabat-Zinn that shows that mindfulness is useful when dealing with chronic pain. When you overcome with chronic pain, instead of fighting on and on, instead of brooding over things and be frustrated, it is important to relax, feel the pain as it is without wanting to change it or judge it, without adding more pain to it, without making things worse. It is important to relax and fully feel the experience without changing it. This negative emotion regulation strategy is rather new. It's usually not studied. What we know is that to solve the matter, people will try and transform their experience, will change it, either avoid it or reinterpret it. What is really new with this approach is that you simply relax. You sit back, you relax, you become aware and you feel the experience, and you manage to give some meaning spontaneously to that difficult situation. We believe that one of the action mechanisms here is the one I've shown you. There's a paradigm here. We had meditation experts that came to see us, people who'd meditated their whole lives, and we put this sensor on their forearm. We put some hot water, almost like when you stick your finger on the hot boiling water. It's not dangerous. Now, meditation experts and non-practicing persons, we compared the two groups. We realize that they describe and feel the same pain, but subjectively their feeling is not the same. It is not as painful or unpleasant for meditation experts. Now, what is the neuronal correlation of this experience, of this specific quality attached to attention? In cerebral brain imagery, we try to understand this. Now, there's the ball signal here, the activity we try and measure with functional imaging in an area that is in the insula, posterior insula, where the sensory feeling of pain is felt. You can see at the bottom of the diagram that when it's slightly warm, the feeling is the same for both groups, but when there's more heat applied, then there's a different reaction. In the sensory cortex, there doesn't seem to be a difference between the two groups. In other areas, the frontal insula, you can see that pain is felt differently. There's an anticipation of emotions, and the profile here is very different when it comes to the two groups. The newcomers, some 20 seconds before they have this feeling of pain, you can see that the neuronal activity increases already. That means that they already anticipate on the pain they're going to feel. They already preempt that feeling, whereas for meditators the profile is different. They don't anticipate, but when they feel that pain, there's a very brief reaction. You can see it in red here, that we interpret as being a radical opening up to the experience. When they feel the pain, it is stronger, more salient, but then it disappears more quickly. So what that study shows is exactly what happens in meditation. You don't anticipate pain. You can see that there's this very strong response when you feel the pain. What is interesting is what happens afterwards. It drops down again very quickly in the case of meditation experts. That means you can let go that pain more quickly. Then we try to understand how this changes over 6 blocks. With newcomers, this anticipation of pain means that block after block, the intensity of the painful response will increase. So we try to regulate these mechanisms. We better understand that if you open up to such an experience without wanting to change it, it may enable you to better tolerate pain. We want to understand, but also quantify this experience. When you look at this diagram, you understand that this is really an experience of the intensity of the pain felt. Well, it's more correlation. That is only one area of the brain. It's the experience of pain and the regulation thereof. On the physiological and causal level, it involves more than that area of the brain. There is a specific behavioral, bodily reaction, for instance. There are other mechanisms I haven't had time to explain here that tells you why there is this regulation. This is an interesting area of the brain. It enables you to understand how meditation can work and be measured. At a causal level, it refers to a much broader network of processes. Now, by way of an example, this shows that you can measure these practices that will not only change the way in which the brain functions, but also the brain anatomy, the brain structure. This is a recent study carried out by a group with Tanja Singer in Germany. During 3 months, they trained newcomers to meditation, mindfulness, compassion, theory of the mind. What is quite spectacular with this study is that you can see that different meditation families that will change the density of gray matter, the volume of gray matter in different brain networks. In other words, the muscles that are trained through these different meditation families will have an impact on different brain networks. And you can see the cumulative traces of these practices on the brain. Now, I would like to refer to another meditation family, benevolence and compassion. Very important in my opinion. Here you can see how you can connect to others again, how you can care more about others. With mindfulness, you focus on yourself. You're therefore more likely and able to listen to others and feel their pain, understand their pain. Through your practice, you also commit yourself to others. You feel empathy with others. And what a study showed was that in a laboratory you can show how such training to mindfulness and compassion will change people's altruism. They'll have a greater capacity to help people. And in the imaging sector, some research work has enabled us to understand the neuronal bases This shows how the brain can be reconfigured. With Mathieu Ricard and Madison, we try to show that meditators have a greater ability to resonate with others, to understand others, particularly when they suffer. Thank you, Antoine. Lutz, how can you measure altruism in a laboratory? This is the 21st century. This is a colloquy called Science, Art and Meditation. Before I hand over to Gaël Chételat, let me just add one final point very briefly. Just a small message, maybe a negative message. This is a rather new field of research. Very little media coverage. Now, these are preliminary studies. There's still some problems with some of the studies. Some clinical studies may sometimes be a little biased. So, as a scientist, you have to be careful about how your data is presented to the greater public, to the public at large. It may be necessary to wait another 15 or 20 years to have very stable, solid data in this area. Basically, what we have here is preliminary data, and let me just come back to St. John Peirce, who establishes this link between science and meditation. Any creation of the mind is poetic in the first meaning of the word. In the equivalence of sensitive and spiritual forms, the same function is used. Now, who goes the furthest? And how can you try and understand, as a scientist or a poet, how can you understand this? This remains a mystery. The answer to these questions doesn't matter. It's a common mystery. Thank you, Antoine Lutz.
Et merci également de bien préciser.
And thank you also for indicating that this is really the very beginning of this kind of work. I'm sure Luc Petton will have things to say about this. Shall we move to Gaël Chételat? As a neuroscientist, you're interested in aging and diseases that go with aging. You also practice meditation. You wanted to see how this can function, and since we're talking about miracles, you managed to get funds. You're working with Antoine Lutz. You managed to get European funds to launch a silver santé study, as you call it, to precisely study the effects and impacts of meditation, of foreign language learning on elderly people. You try to understand how one can better age thanks to these meditation practices. Gaël.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Yes, indeed. It's something that we set up on a European level with a group of experts. I'm not alone, of course. Antoine Lutz is part of it. There are 10 partners in 6 European countries looking at different domains which are interesting. Emotions, for example, lifestyles, meditation, aging. And the starting point is this one. How can you age well? And what is stopping you from aging well? Some people are aging and getting more fulfilled more and more, whereas for other people it is more difficult. So let's identify the reasons why it is more difficult for some people. Because we have raised the expectation of life, and then we want to continue to live in good health. Otherwise, we're going to increase the number of years when you're going to continue to live, but not in good health. So the factors which are reducing the quality of life in aging people is, for example, problems of sleep, anxiety, being depressed. It could also be cognitive dementia problems, cognitive problems. So it's not just a miracle that we offer against all of this, but with the work presented by Antoine, we know that there is an effect on attention. Attention is only one cognitive capacities and functions that tends to reduce while you're aging. It is so. And other work are demonstrating a beneficial impact on psychoaffective factors that tend to degrade the quality of life, depression, anxiety, stress, for example. And then in the risks for degenerative illnesses, the factors that can increase the risk of degenerative mental diseases. We have examples, factors such as what I've quoted already, anxiety, depression, and sleep problems. So through our study, we want to study to see how all of this functions, and also how can you meditate or other activities can have an impact on to make your body, your brain, your mind work so that you can live and age better. What sort of effect can it have, scientifically speaking, with a real protocol on a sample group of people that we're going to follow over a certain number of years? Yes, that's what we're going to look at, is looking at meditation and also learning of English. That's interesting for us because it enables us to do a comparison between the two different groups, and then we have a control group that is not going to be worked on. Those are going to be on 18 months, so over 18 months, those people engaged in this research are coming once a week for one session of meditation in a group with a teacher, expert teacher, and for English it's going to be the same thing, one session per week with a teacher, and then every day they will continue their exercises with some tools. We give them a tablet and we give them some exercises either to learn English or to be meditating for at least 20 minutes a day, and then they'll give a report of what they've done. Then we see the long-term effects, not just looking at well-being effects, what we're hoping fundamentally to impact positively. We talked about pain, for example, how you can live through pain more easily. For example, live through aging more easily, and also look at more biological measures to show up and evaluate how the impact can be on the biological processes. We're going to look at neuroimagery, epigenetics, markers in the blood, or imaging markers on the well-being, emotions, aging processes, and the factors of risks for Alzheimer's diseases, which are going to be interesting for us, and biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease that can be showing up even at the very start of things. Gaël, Chételat, this démarche and this approach as a scientist, a meditator yourself, what do you want to do? Do you want to understand what can be helping us to age well? Why is it that sometimes people don't age very well? We have an aging population, and as you said, we want to improve the more lengthy age we will have. Do you want to put your own personal experience in challenge here? So how, as a scientist, meditator yourself, how can you study scientifically the effects, the impact of meditation? Well, we bring one stone to the building. How to determine the good aging process, it's very difficult, so we'll try and contribute to it a little bit. And personally, I think it's a meeting up between researchers that I have started about 20 years ago on aging, Alzheimer, physiopathological impacts to try and change the way things evolve in a person, and my own personal practice that more and more makes me think that meditation can be one of the answers that we can give to a better aging process. And for me, I want to demonstrate some tools that I know, which are scientific tools. I can do it in another way, but what I can do is science. And this is how I would like to approach this issue. Not to convince, but really to bring some strong evidence in favor. What I don't want to anticipate what we'll find, but to impact. And the results you're expecting when? Well, we already have results of a pilot project that we've done already, not within this study, but one study that we did just before to try and convince the European Commission to finance us with preliminary results. We had some experts meditating. We had 600 who accepted to come to Caen for scans, and we compared their data compared to a database that we already had with people who had roughly the same age, the same characteristics, but didn't practice meditation throughout their life. And we saw that there is a certain cerebral areas that preserved, even though they were impacted by aging. So we all age physiologically, and those regions in the brain were more protected in the meditating experts. So that, of course, we've got that to take it with just a punch of salt, but these are preliminary studies and results that encourage us to continue studying. It's a very vast project. I'll only talk to you about one part of it. There'll be over the years to come, we'll do a lot of studies. What I'm talking to you here, the 3 groups which are going to meditate and learn English, it's only going to start in 2020, but we have other projects on the meditating experts. We also have a European-wide study on patients at the very start of Alzheimer's disease, and also results should be looked at probably before. We'll come back to this about the scientific community, how they look at your work, because your work is totally acknowledged, but yourself, you are really at the very, very beginning, and we've got to be careful about what we say about it. Jean-Philippe Lachaux, you're working on all those examples which are interesting. So, as in with Antoine Lutz, you're looking at attention. Attention, we can look at it. Attention is what we're focusing on. We're all distracted. You know that you've got a wandering brain. We have worked on schools with school children. So how can you measure attention in your brain? Well, there's plenty of ways to do whether you're attentive or mindful in your brain or not. This is probably one of the research domains which are much more important in the research right now. What is astonishing is that this new research which is produced, there's not a lot that goes through to the major public. Public doesn't have much access to all of these data. I'll talk about it later on. I'm sure that I'll talk about it later on. People who are trying to manipulate attention in classrooms, for example, the teachers, they manipulate attention. What do you mean? Well, as you're trying to work on a dough, making a pizza is just handling attention. It might not be the best word to use, manipulating. But anyway, there's a responsibility, I think, to be taken over by the researcher on attention to try and know those knowledge. Attention is becoming a very major issue in societies because we beg for attention from a lot of people. So you see that it is really impacted far too much, and we see also that we are extremely easily distracted. Why are we so easily distracted? We do realize it ourselves by meditating. We do know that our spirits are wandering, so this is why maybe you look at attention. Attention, mental state, we were talking about it. I had my notes, and of course what I forgot to say is to connect with the question of Caroline, to come back to what I wanted to say. What do you really want to say, Jean-Philippe? Yes, that's what I'm coming to now. What I wanted to say is we are the first generation that can meditate knowing exactly, well, a little bit what's happening in the brain while meditating. This is jolly interesting. And I'm coming back to attention now, if you allow me. I just want to say 3 examples of things that we can have as knowledge of our brain to try and use to guide our studying and informed introspection, knowing how our mental is functioning. And I try to convince you by 3 examples, and it can enrich us, maybe just to give us a little bit of information on meditation as it is practiced now. First example, which I think very spectacular, dramatic, in the 50 last years, is to highlight the quantity of autopilot processes that we have in our mental brains. We did suspect that existed in very simple behaviors, for example, reactions to everything that is hot. That's quite reflex, but we realize that those autopilot processes are determining our cognitive processes such as language. And as soon as you chain up after a certain rhythm, you haven't got a capacity to choose exactly what you're doing. One example that I have is the language. When you're talking about 3 to 4 words a second, and we know fully that you cannot, it's impossible to choose those words if you go too fast. It goes too fast. You stumble over your own thinking. You're a spectator. You're just a listener of your words. And if everything goes well, you can just monitor that your brain is slightly working quite well and you're making sense. Well, you're saying, well, this is reassuring, yes, but indeed it's mind-boggling to see how this is all working. And what is unbelievable is also that globally things are working quite well. Globally they work, so you don't say anything stupid. So what? You can change your posture. You can saying, well, taking a hindsight to try and, if I try to control my mental state, my second after second, moment after moment, this is an illusion. I can let go, and it works very well on its own. So let go of it. And you understand what I mean by that. So we adopt this sort of semi-observation of your own mental life, your own mental activities. You realize that everything goes all right. You are not really controlling your car. You're just looking at it. You're the inspector in a driving school, and you might say, well, maybe here we could change things, but maybe you can just let go and everything goes well. It's on autopilot and everything goes very well. It doesn't need to be controlled. So we can let go of our tensions so that we have a better attention. Yes, we can take out the clinging control wish. When you go into a center of meditation, people are saying focusing your attention on your breathing. One phenomenon, if you focus on your breathing, you're trying to control it, and then you breathe just about in a totally chaotic way. Those who went to the military service, they were told to work according to a certain rhythm, and they couldn't do it anymore because they were trying too much to control. So we've got to go into capacity without over-controlling ourselves. If you apply it to respiration, to breathing, that you can go into your ears, you can control the position of your eyes, or you can let go, and they'll work perfectly all right. And there's a little bit of margin. When you observe things, you can see that later on you can apply that to your own mental development. The thoughts, reactions are going to diverge and develop on their own. And you can let go, and you can just be a spectator, just viewer, and just adopting a few things, that's all. What you're trying to say, Jean-Philippe, is that this study of attention is really coming through meditation practice, because meditation practitioners do say that things finally happen quite naturally without any control. And this is what you're saying. In order to develop our own attention, it's not another form of control that we want to improve. We want to just observe what is happening on its own. It's a soft, gentle control, like you're trying to ride a horse instead of being too hard on the bridle. You can say, have an anticipation of your animal, your horse, or your brain. You anticipate this is going to happen if I think that, this thought is going to emerge, and so on. And really, and stop me if I take too much time. No, 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 I want to listen. We also see that how much those automatic mechanisms can create something bizarre, and informed introspection is very important here. I'm thinking of the situation when you had an argument during the day, and then you go back home and you ruminate about it, you think it over again. It's very difficult for a brain to realize that there's a real problem, you've got to react. You're on your settee in the evening, you remember the person is not there anymore. Why bother about thinking about this problem? It's over. And the fact is that for a brain, you have to recreate the situation. It's complicated because you have to generate an image of the person you had an argument and an argument with it, and you have to recreate their face in front of you, replay their threatening voice maybe, and try and give it a tension in your body to know that you're in a bad circumstance. You have to recreate all of that in order to motivate the person on their settee comfortably to really think about it and to try and find a solution. Otherwise they do something else. They look the footy on the TV and whatever. What happens in the brain, this putting it into music, is different zones of the brain which are very distant, and they have to be activated together as a concert. And this symphony which is created is not that not easy to create. If you have an attention on one particular element and you highlight just one element, everything, the whole thing collapses around you. And in meditation, mindfulness, there is this game, in fact. You will give your attention to all the sensations in your body, and if you just look at one sensation, the whole thing is going to collapse around. This whole music is going to collapse, and the violin is all of a sudden far too loud over everybody. And then you focus on that, and then the whole thing collapses around. And to know how it functions, you can guide this little gesture to try and find out what happens when I give this attention to my crispation, to my tension. If I give my attention to one mental image, maybe it can be highlighted. Maybe if I think about something, I can find something else. Well, really, we are looking at the mystery of encrypting of our brains. There's a real toing and froing between science and conscience. This is the study of our roundtable mindfulness meditation, what sort of impact it can have on our mental development. We'll go even further than that, and Perla is taking the floor and taking the mic. We'll go further to the cells, to the DNA. You're a biochemist, Perla. And you have decided to see, we are looking at the mysteries, extraordinary developments in science, to explore the impact of mindfulness meditation through our genes to the very molecules. It is already possible now with the present techniques.
Thank you, Caroline. Indeed, today in laboratories we have the means to look at what is minute, very small, even DNA, chromosomes, the nucleus of our cells. As far as the nucleus of our cells, you can try and see what happens from a genetic or epigenetic point of view. Please tell us what this word means, epigenetics. I'll try. We have little time, hence I'll tell you a little story. A little story I like a lot about Darwin. When Darwin came up with his theory on the origin of species, he said he was faced with a difficulty that he found fatal and impossible to overcome. The difficulty was to do with bees. In the world of bees, there's something very strange happening. The queens are the only ones that are fertile. They're likely to lay millions of eggs in a day. All the other bees are sterile, and Darwin couldn't understand why and how the ordinary bees hadn't disappeared by natural selection, because they can't reproduce. Today, we know that this has nothing to do with DNA nor with development. This difference between the queen and other bees is not due to DNA. When a bee is born, her fate is not defined. She may be a queen or an ordinary bee. Where is that DNA going to go? It depends on the external environment. It has nothing to do with DNA. In this specific case, it has to do with the food the bees receive during their first few days. If they're given royal jelly, they become queens. If not, they become ordinary bees. So this is what I mean by epigenetics. It induces chemical changes around DNA. That means that some of the genes in the DNA are active or passive. In a queen bee, the active genes are different from the active ones in the ordinary bees. They have the same DNA, though. When it comes to human beings, that applies too. I mean, royal jelly is very useful for human beings. The impact of mindfulness and meditation may be compared to that royal jelly. Well, almost. But I want to be careful, as my colleagues Antoine and Gaël were. We are currently carrying out studies, and these studies are only in their infancy. We're only starting to study these phenomena. In a very nice study carried out with Richie Davidson and Antoine, we managed to show that expert meditators, after a 1 day or 8 hours meditation, like this little retreat we went on with John 3 days ago, well, the meditating experts present epigenetic changes in the blood cells. Now, we can't look at the brain. We can't go and carry out a brain biopsy. No meditator would allow us to do that. But we can take blood samples, isolate blood cells, and on the basis of these cells, isolate DNA, RNA, proteins, and investigate. So we saw that there were epigenetic changes similar to the ones described in mice. When they're adults, you can take away epigenetic signatures that they acquired during the 2 first weeks of their lives in mice. Now, when it comes to meditating experts, we've seen there are similar epigenetic mechanisms that occur after 8 hours of meditation. The mechanisms seem fairly similar. Now, you said these studies are only in their infancy. There are, I guess, already some pointers that show that epigenetics are very important and that we may have a role to play. We could influence our genes for the better or the worse. We could influence our genes through our activities. Yes, we have more and more scientific evidence of the impact of the lifestyle on epigenetics. Meditation, food, physical activities, our different habits and behaviors, for instance, the use of toxic substances, the financial situation we're in. This whole environment When I use the word environment, I mean environment in the broadest sense of the word. The air we breathe in, what we eat, what we do, what we think, who we're with, how we behave with others and ourselves. So there are scientists working on these issues today. There are many of you, but you all tend to be very careful because these are only research pointers and a lot of questions. Luc Petton, I would like you to react to this. We were talking about bees and mice. As a choreographer, well, I'd be quite tempted to work with bees. That's interesting. But would you like to react to what you've heard? You've heard these different scientists tell us about their work. How do you react to that? You work with dancers and animals. What happens from an epigenetic point of view? Does it change anything? It certainly changes my artistic perception of the subject matter I work on or create. As artists, we have to be open up to mysteries. We shouldn't try and explain these mysteries. That's somebody else's job. Well, precisely when it comes to mystery, I'd like to put this question to all of you. Maybe it is more present in the scientific domain as well. Some things may be considered mysterious. It doesn't mean you shouldn't study them. So this is a question to all of you. Your colleagues, scientists, what is their point of view of the work you carry out? Epigenetics, meditation, etc. Gaël, Antoine, who would like to react? Well, I can start. I work on aging and Alzheimer's disease. I work with neurologists and physicians, pharmacists, etc., chemists. I think their judgment will be the following. Either they're surprised or critical about this approach that is not a medicine-based approach, i.e. you don't offer a medication. It's a non-pharmacological offer. You don't look at the disease from a purely biological point of view. So you have to step back a little bit when you talk about mysteries. I'm not sure scientists are ready to study mysteries. In our project, we focus very much on mechanisms. And the fact that we said we're not just going to study the sole impact, but we're going to try and understand mechanisms, that's what people liked. That is a more solid basis in the eyes of the scientific community. There's sometimes some scientific puzzlement as well when it comes to certain techniques. I'm sure that Jean-Philippe can say a word about that. It's important to study mechanisms, and the work you carry out should also give us an insight into how we function. That can certainly be of interest to scientists. Jean-Philippe, very briefly, when it comes to mysteries, I don't mind if mysteries disappear little by little. What will not disappear is that we will continue marveling about life and human beings. You may explain everything, you may be able to explain a lot of things, but certain things are unexplainable. They're just beautiful. I work a lot on attention. It's a very orthodox and honest topic in my area. Meditation may be a little questionable for some people. Of course, attention attracts attention from a lot of people, interests a lot of people. When I say to my colleagues, well, for the next 5 years, I won't publish so many articles. What I'm more interested in is going out into schools and tell teachers how to work on their pupils' attention. And they say, why would you not publish articles? Well, because applied research is exactly that. You have to go out and apply your knowledge concretely. Now, you go out into schools. As a scientist, you thought about how you can pass on your knowledge. So how can people understand this work you carry out on attention? There is a program called Apple, focusing on attention in schools. There's metacognitive teaching. You show pupils how to understand their teaching process. There's distractions, there's attention, there are biological phenomena, there are constraints. So I'll try and understand these different laws and rules and use them, apply them. Give pupils and children long-term cognitive approaches to enable them to understand these mechanisms. It's the teacher who is trained who will then train his pupils. It's like a Trojan horse. It's a way of introducing the topic in schools. Pupils talk about attention, their parents talk about attention, and the program enables children to change each school activity in some kind of meditation. We never mention the word meditation, but when you look at it more closely, you can see meditation is present, but it is introduced via a scientific bias. Antoine, Lutz.
Antoine, j'aimerais bien vous poser aussi cette question.
Antoine, Lutz, I want to ask you questions about the mystery and how you look at things. Well, the mystery for me, we can give a scientific explanation. It's a physiological phenomenon. But the mystery subsists because we try to give a scientific explanation. And at the end of the day, if you are suffering from cancer and you're in a terminal phase of your life, well, it's not going to help you to manage the mystery. How, as a person, are you going to give a meaning to your life here and now? That will remain a mystery, because there's always an opening that you have to reactivate all the time. So the mystery, because it is a mystery, will stay, even if you provide more general scientific explanations. Science and awareness of what the human condition is all about, and the way other people look at things or at you. When I finished my thesis with Francisco Varela, I also worked with David Richardson, who died of Alzheimer's disease, and he told me that I was leaving science in going into meditation, and I smiled because I saw how quickly our community accepted this change, because we're starting to have empirical data which are quite convincing, and things are changing thanks to imaging. Yes, the work that has been quoted, and I think it's clinical research that is there. Doctors are more attracted by this, because if something works at a clinical level, then if patients improve, they suffer less, and that is enough. So before you understand the mechanism, and the pioneering work of John Kabat-Zinn have revolutionized things. People know that it works, it can be used clinically, and doctors and psychiatrists accept it more. And when you go into molecular biology, people judge more, because they work at a different scale. They work at molecular level, and they are looking at more complex phenomena, and how this can have an impact on the genetic expression. So that is more difficult to study scientifically. These are ill-understood things, and there is a negative perception of this. But this all depends whether people have an open mind. But Gaël, this works. That's what you were saying on your study on aging and how to age well. I think it what was said at a roundtable, because we know that what are the positive impact of sports and also the good impact of meditation on awareness. Well, it isn't yet validated and how it works. I think you have to look at different elements that can help your well-being and your mental well-being. There is a link between what you eat. Perla, maybe you could talk about that. But when you look at this whole range that you can use for aging well, and also with the child, you have sports, you have social well-being, and all these different elements, if you put them together, or you may use one more than the other, depending on what you want to do. All these elements will contribute to people aging better. So in what state do we eat, and what is our state as well? So what is the scientific community position? Because we know that this is quite complex. We don't know how this is going to happen, and indeed we could have something that will move more quickly than we think. I mean, there is an impact on our genes, even on epigenetics. So this work at a molecular level require quite a lot of time, and they need to be validated scientifically. Yes, epigenetics is an area which is exploding, I would say, to such an extent that today there are whole scientific conferences which are concentrate on epigenetic transmission on different generations or transgenerational transfer, because more and more there is scientific proof that there is possible to transmit to the generations to come our personal experience. So it's not something metaphysical. When a pregnant woman is exposed to a given factor in the environment, like stress or trauma or violence or precariousness, there are 3 generations who are potentially exposed: the pregnant woman, the fetus, and the germinal cells which are already present in the fetus. And maybe one day those germinal cells will be expressed as the grandchild of this pregnant woman. It doesn't mean that the grandchild will inherit the experience of this pregnant woman, but we have more and more examples in scientific literature where we can see that this is the case. And in fact, when you have fertilization, the epigenetic markers disappear. But we don't quite know yet why at times it isn't rubbed out. So you can have an effect from the environment and not from the DNA. Several generations and down. You can see that in flowers. There are epigenetics which are transmitted in flowers. The exposure was in the first generation, and you will find it 100 generations below. Amongst mammals, you can see it 4 or 5 generations down. In worms, you can see the effect of the environment, which was experienced by 5 generations, up to 40 generations down. In human beings, it's more difficult because luckily most of us, we have a life which is longer. For a searcher following 40 generations of a family, that requires 1,000 years. So we can't do that. We don't have the funds to do it, basically. Not yet, at any rate. And these studies would be fascinating because it goes both ways. You may have an impact on several generations, but both ways. since we are in a meeting which is science and art and meditation, we can imagine that this can be transformed in a good way. Yes, because it gives us a perspective of interdependence when you look at these studies, because with regard to meditation in particular, this leads us to see that meditation should not be perceived only individually or interpersonally, but that meditation has a potential on different generations. We don't know yet because we haven't yet carried out studies, but potentially this is there, it exists. You have the principle of precaution in toxology, and stress is so toxic. It's chemical. Negative emotions are chemical, and this principle of precaution could be applied to stress, to war, to genocides, precariousness, and what have you. These are all stress factors, and we could apply all these programs to give a better potential. What I want to say that I'm in awe of the programs that have been presented at political, educational, economic levels, at the level of regions who are subject to violence and war. And I think that these are very important work and extremely encouraging, and perhaps through epigenetic mechanisms will have beneficial effects, and that will be beneficial for several generations and probably our species. Well, let us dream, because we were talking about the silent dream before. Let us dream together. Why not?
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions?
Are there any questions from our audience, members of the audience? Because we have a panel here who are experimenting many things, and we can extend this conversation to have members of the audience. I see a question. Hello. I don't know whether how I'm going to put this. I'm reading a Greg Marden book, The Great Matrix, and it's what I would like to ask Perla. If more and more people start meditating, we will reach a critical mass that will make great changes, provide great changes in our lives and in our universe, because we're all interconnected. And this quality of presence we're going to develop, will it have an impact? And go along with what you said about epigenetics. Thank you for this question, Perla. It's the critical mass that I wanted to talk about, because if we meditate, we will reach this critical mass, and maybe we will start reversing things. Well, thank you for that question. It's a great question. I've wondered about it myself, but I do not have the elements to give you a scientific answer and based on molecular evidence. But when you look at evolution, and the greatest force for evolution is innovating behavior and propagation of new habits, and that has a greater impact even more than the environment. So we human beings, we innovate our behavior, we create new habits. That's what we do best, in fact. So we have to be very attentive to what are these new types of behaviors and what habits are we transmitting and that we are propagating, if you like that word. we have to be very attentive, very careful. And the question that comes to mind, there are studies which have shown that 5 generations are exposed and you will find the same habit or change in behavior 40 generations and down. Now, you cannot, this is for worms, but we cannot extrapolate. But one can dream it may happen. One can imagine it can happen. So 5 generations of human beings represents 125 years. It's more than the life of an individual. So 40 generations is 1,000 years or so. Imagine if this change of behaviors had been focused on compassion, ethics, ecological awareness, environmental awareness, and if that had been if we cultivate that during all our life, maybe it could have an effect 10 centuries down. Imagine that. Well, let us imagine if. Why not?
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres belles questions? Oui,
Do you have any other questions? Yes, I would have a question, and good morning. It's with regard to the functioning of the brain. I've spent many years in the Amazon basin and in Mexico. I've met a great many shamans who work with substances and with plants that actually activate one part of the brain. And have you seen that it has, in your observations, whether substances or meditation activates this part or this gland in the brain? Well, no, not that particular region, but you are referring to the work of Lachowsky. But there is a toad in the northern part of Mexico that has been studied. I don't know whether it has an impact on many neurotransmitters and whole regions of the brain, and particularly an impact on serotonin, and what will be affected by these drugs that do not only affect one region of the brain. So the answer is that we haven't observed that, and you can very well understand the link between the two. It's a vast question, because such a drug will affect many chemicals in the brain. There is some interest nowadays to scientifically explore the parallel that exists between meditation state and hypnotism and the trances in which shamans go, or when they use psychedelic substance. We're going back to the 70s there. And in 2019, in fact, the NCCON workshop, we will bring together about 40 researchers in meditation, hypnotism, and researchers in psychedelic substances to understand what are activated when you use these 3 different elements. But at the moment, we do not have a unified knowledge, but it's something that is going to be explored by the scientific community.
Also, we need to understand scientifically how all of this functions without any given ideas. Yes, the psychological psychedelic substances, LED, for example, are being used in some clinics, in some hospitals in Switzerland, in the US. I know one case for example, patients in terminal cancer stations, if they are looking at this existential drug taking, it can open up a door to an approach of death which is then different. And then we can try and look at those access doors to exploration of the conscience, of the mind. Thank you very much. Another question. Hello, thank you very much. I would like to ask you, after listening to everything that you talked about the epigenetics throughout generations, and the fact that apparently we're not very much masters of what we are saying, so it seems to be something that is subconsciously functioning. Are we talking about the subconscious and the in the psychoanalysis, what was said more than 100 years ago, some ideas which are coming up with different words now. Intuitions seem to have a common fragrance with this, what you're saying now, things which are transmitted transgenerationally without us knowing, without us deciding. And some elements, well, maybe have meant to do that, but it goes on autopilot, so something is functioning underneath and I haven't got any power on it, I haven't chosen anything. Wonderful question. Maybe Jean-Philippe Lachaux, you could answer this question. I'm not going to try and comment on psychoanalysis because I don't really know much about it, quite frankly. But from the neurosciences, knowing that we haven't got access fully to some functionings, well, I wouldn't say it's totally obvious, but we're not highlighting that so much. Obviously, we can't be conscious of everything that's happening. All of our gestures are largely determined by the way that all of this is organized, connected, impacted by what happened beforehand in our lives. Whether it is a highway to our subconscious, well, I don't know. I really can't tell you much more about that. Antoine, Lutz, or maybe Perla, you have something to say about that? It's a difficult question. I think we really have to look into detail what we really talk about subconscious and define it more profoundly. It's an automatic processes of our brains, the psychoanalytical subconscious. Well, we would use the whole day to talk about it. I think this question needs to be really gone into more deeply, so we have to study it further. But we go to another question. My question is totally linked up to that, actually. There is wisdom that works very well if you're not hindering it yourself. I would say it's the dimension of Freud. He highlighted those notions. We can see that there's a spiritual dimension. Let the inner master work well. If he works well, it's the same way of saying different things. And when you're looking at psychoanalysis, there's Jung and the symbolic functioning. So where are we placed here? All of this is functioning. This is an important dimension of human being. Jung has discovered a good many interesting things, and for me, this is the blind task that you will find in any approach, any scientific science, and one of the blind tasks of cognitive science is this one, the symbolic dimension and the subconscious. I've seen not long ago a text talking to me about the default system, and the default system in cognitive science seems to be very much linked up to that. Here we are looking at science and conscience in the roundtable. The default system, does anybody want to talk about it? Yes, indeed. There's a reference to a paper that was published a few years ago that talked about default systems, the networks in the prefrontal middle cortex of the brain, which is looking at the choice of your discourse, internal models of your own thoughts, of your own history, antecedents. When you're thinking about other people, we try to simulate the beliefs and the spirits of the others, and this is one of the regions of the brain where we found a difference with the meditators, and Gaël could talk about it much better than me. And we have experts who gave an interpretation of Freudian interpretation of those default systems and processes. Well, myself, I'm not really competent to answer really this question. I don't really know Jung's philosophy that much. But what is quite true is that, and this is linked to the theme of the consciousness, is this research for some meaning. This is within the core of the life of every living being, gives some meaning to anything that's happening. And this default process network seems to be a network that is extremely important in the hierarchy of the central nervous system and seems to have a very huge symbolic function. Gaël, do you want to? There's loads of other questions. Maybe we'll give a chance to Gaël to give an answer very, very quickly. This default system, we do realize that it is activated when we don't do anything particularly. That means that reflects the thoughts that we could have freely emerging. When we're at leisure, for example, we imagine a scenario to anticipate things, to remember the list of our shopping that we have to do, a conversation or an argument we've just had. So that's when it happens in all those activities that this network is going to be triggered. It could be bad in the Alzheimer's disease, for example. Alzheimer is going to attack straight away those areas of the default network, and the more this default network is going to be activated by mental process such as ruminating over, going over things instead of living in the present time, more those areas are going to be weakened. And this is a hypothesis. It's not at all proven yet, but it is quite important to see that these default networks can have an impact on this science and conscience issue, and it can have an impact on the aging and the mental and physical aging. Jean-Philippe, do you want to add anything? I can see there's a lot of questions, so maybe we'll go over to the next question. Let's go. Thank you very much for all of those presentations. It's absolutely wonderful to see that the neurosciences are open to meditation and it's possible to find some funding. It's absolutely beautiful. It's difficult to find research funding, so thank you very much. For meditation, I wanted to know if it has an influence on neurogenesis and if the epigenetics is transmitted to the neurons. Neurogenesis, can you explain? Is creating new neurons, isn't it? Well, yes. There's not necessarily studies that demonstrated it, but what we know is that neurogenesis that happens in one of the sub-regions of the brain is influenced by our mental state and diminished when you're having latent stress situations. And meditation, we can think, can have an influence on this neurogenesis. Well, I don't know if it has been demonstrated. It's one of the measures that we're going to do, especially in Gaël's laboratory in Caen soon, where we are looking at imaging of anatomical on the pituitary gland, the hippocampus, and look at the different projects. Perla. For human beings, as I said before, it is not possible to observe transmission of epigenetic changes in the brain because it would be far too invasive and nobody would be a volunteer to leave a certain part of their brain on the lab slab. But in some mammals, we can see that there are epigenetic changes that happens provoked by stress, triggered by some trauma. And this goes through to the following generations. And influences are approach to stress, to be very depressive, etc., and so on, can be transmitted to the children, grandchildren, and so on. But that's in the mammals and the rodents. Now, the biological mechanisms do exist. Also, what we know in humankind, for example, is that some factors in the environment, such as taking exercise, feeding yourself properly, can leave some traces in the spermatozoids, for example, on the genes, which are in charge of brain development. So we don't know if this is seen later on in the development of the brain of a child later on, but there are epigenetic traces that exist. I hope that's a good answer to you. One thing that I want to add to this is that one fascinating aspect of epigenetics, it is reversible. In other words, everything that we know, everything to do with stress, negative emotions, violence. For example, we have some data about the descendants of survivors of the Holocaust, the lower generations who were exposed before they were fetuses to the Holocaust, not during the pregnancy. So it is a transgenerational transmission as such. And we can find traces of epigenetics changes that will impact their resistance to stress in the adult descendants. So the message is that potentially it is reversible, and this is why we do all of those studies and research to try and find if there are ways to intervene in a non-pharmacological way, specifically through stress reduction, through meditation, that could maybe help to erase those markers. And we do know, for example, that in animals, being exposed to one environment which is enriched, in other words, there's one stimulation for cognitive behavior, for visual stimulations, for example, the parias for a mouse, for example, this will leave some epigenetic traces of trauma, acquired trauma, in the first few stages of life. So this is encouraging for us. So for humankind, human people, we are also animals. Absolutely, yes, of course. Even if we can't extrapolate, we do know that there are some similar mechanisms that exist in humankind. And this is why we are triggering all those studies, and it is very important that we see that there are indeed epigenetics changes that are happening thanks in response to meditation. Thank you very much. Another question. We've been trying to give answers to a lot of questions. Hello. My question is the following, to bounce off on what Perla just said just now. And it's linked up to the work on attention by Jean-Philippe. Here we talk about a wonderful world, a paradise for the mice. And we talk about negative emotions and stresses that can be generated genetically and biologically in animals. But I suppose, without any doubt, also in humankind. My question is totally the reverse. I work on including in business some high emotions, to cultivate them in the leadership and in the working environment, in mindfulness, elevated emotions such as joy to come to work, compassion for colleagues in the leadership, and mindfulness, benevolence with a capital B, and levels that will change the atmosphere in the working environment and therefore your work. I work on this because I am convinced that in the first stage there are some effects from the neuroplasticity of the brain and the autonomous nervous system and all of the negative impacts of stress when you're in a stressful environment. But when you're changing that into a more secure, more joyful, more happy and compassionate environment, then you're going to find more elevated, noble emotions, and you'll have endorphins and such type of hormones which are more beneficial for the body, which will be secreted. Can't we now highlight that in the business so that we can change the working environment in enterprises so that the wage earners can have their life improved? We're not all wage earners, but we have to improve our generation now and for the following generation. Is this an invitation or a question? Well, it's an invitation and a question. Does anybody want to answer to this wonderful invitation? Perla, thank you for this question. Indeed, we're going to continue in the lab to manipulate, to try and find, improve all of this, but this is as a supplement to that. But you all, you can do what you've just said. That's exactly what I talked about, is the principle of precaution. So it's not going to harm, it can only be beneficial if it's well done. And in the meantime, we are going to try and find, from our own point of view, from pure and hard science, we're going to try and give some names to the molecules, etc. But we have enough evidence in mammal models, and we're starting to have evidence in human beings to implement all of this benevolence on ourselves, on our children, next of kin, friends, colleagues at work, and especially people who are unknown yet to us. So, Jean-Philippe, if we are really giving a lot of attention to all those emotions, we can see that there is a significant link from the neuroscientific point of view. And there are major changes that we can measure these days on the fact that you focus your attention and that you have an impact on the autopilot that you have in your brain. Jean-Philippe Lachaux? As long as I recognize this is me, whether you call me Jean-François or Jean-Philippe, it doesn't matter. Well, attention, what does it do? It filters our perception of the outside world. It highlights some things, downlights other things, and you can bias in a positive way some facts which are triggering more positive emotions. It's quite true that a depressed person is going to be more sensitive to things that chime with their mood. So they are more going for the negative impact. So we have to look at different glasses to look at the world in a different way, in a more positive way. And I see that through my own experience in schools, we realize how very important it is that once you've looked at a business somewhere in a group and you're trying to bring the gospel, the good word, the person who takes the relay from us understands very profoundly the core of what you're trying to teach, because it can shift the teaching to trigger some positive emotions in a business, and then people are going to watch each other. Oh, well, he's not that positive today. Well, he's really blacked out. He must be on a red list because he's not so positive. So it can be totally reversed and work badly. So you've got to be very careful about it. Thank you very much. We're going to take the next question now.
On est sûr d'être, comment dire,
Let's try and be genuinely positive. If not, let's accept that we can also be negative. Next question. Hello, everyone. First, I would like to say how grateful, how immensely grateful I am to you. I'm very moved. I have the impression I'm learning a lot of things. We meditated all together, and that meditation enabled me to put myself in that state of mind. Now, can you tell me if there is a link between meditation and the ability to learn? And then a question on attention. Now, intention, attention, can you combine the two, and how and what happens if you combine them? Let me tackle the second part. Intention is crucial. In the Atoll program, we tell pupils what attention means, how you formalize it. you have to be very clear about what you're going to do with them, and that puts the brain in optimum situation to select what is important and not. So it's focused attention, as Antoine would call it. It's very difficult not to have an intention. In the Japanese Zen, mushokuto, being without an aim. Well, there's always some fine-tuning happening. Your attention focuses a little more on this, a little less on that. There is a certain intention behind it. It's difficult to get rid of it. But a person is more efficient when they have a clear intention. So we're trying to look at this quite precisely. And our society sometimes puts us in a situation where you have a lot of intentions, although they're mostly contradictory. And this is quite funny, you'll see. Beforehand, well, it's about the disappearance of physical context. Today, thanks to the digital tools, you can do so many things at the same time. Talk to all your friends, send umpteen mails, etc. So at some point in time, you may have 1,000 intentions allowed for by the context, and they're sometimes, if not mostly, contradictory. That may be one of the reasons why there's this ill at ease in our society today, why so many people have a burnout. It is often linked to the fact that we have so many intentions in our minds, and it's more and more difficult to be aware of that. And then clear up our act and decide what is important in the next few minutes. What is important for me? Then there's attention, learning, meditation. Now, if your attention focuses on things, doesn't wander so much here and there, you will find that time to establish those links and connections with your experience. That will mean that you're more receptive. To react to the first part of your question, I work with scientists and researchers who have their own practice. They have a self-centered practice in a way. Sometimes you can understand them better. Would Gaël or maybe Antoine like to react to the first part of your question? Well, I'll try, and then I'll hand over to you. Cognitive neurosciences are specific. We work on a subject matter we live with on a daily basis. It's not like astrophysics, where your subject matter is very far away if you haven't got a telescope. Here, we're always working on the subject matter we're dealing with, from the time we get up till the moment we go to bed, so we can always test that object or that subject. Antoine, I think it's been covered. Could we take more questions? Yes, maybe here. Hello, thank you for your interventions. I have a question on anatomical changes of the brain. Let's take an example. I meditate for 4 years, then I stop for a year or maybe 2 years, and I start meditating again. Now, to glean the same changes and benefits, will my background in meditation help me to find those benefits again more quickly? That's an interesting question, Gaël. The answer is, today we don't really know. In the project I mentioned, this European project I mentioned, we're going to look at the impact of meditation training during 18 months. We'll take measurements before and after these 18 months, and then in the long run, 21 months after having stopped the intervention, do we still observe the same effects we may have observed after 18 months of meditation? So this is going to continue interesting us. I think that what we've learned and understood, the muscles we trained, well, one can expect all that to be in a different state than before the 4 years that lasted that intervention. So common sense means that we will certainly be in a different state, even if you stop practicing for some time. Now, 2 comments, maybe contradictory, but first I'd like to react to what Gaël said. Intuitively, yes, if you stop your practice, then when you pick it up again, it may be easier than it was when you first started it. For instance, juggling. When you learn juggling after 6 or 8 weeks, you can see that in the frontal cortex, the volume of grey matter will increase. And what is interesting is that when you look at the brain again, several months after somebody stopped practicing that activity, you can see the area retracting, getting smaller. It's like a muscle. It has to train regularly. You have to continue practicing to reap the same effects. So that is why we encourage people to practice on a daily basis. And when you say that, you wonder about meditation. Some types of meditation apparently when you've had this intuition, you've reached a point of no return. What does that mean? It means that you can acquire something. Well, it is a rather theoretical issue. For neuroscientists, it's a good question. We can't really answer it. You have to be able to understand the very nature of the mind. It's not something we fully understood. There seems to be a point of no return, after which your perception changes. There may be two possible scenarios here. But again, we have not accumulated enough data on that. It's a bit like your memory. When you've done something yesterday, you did it yesterday, you remember it the following day, remember some details, and then there's something you did 10, 20, 30 years ago. You don't recall it in the same way, but it may have impregnated our cells more precisely. And these types of memories may not be located in the same place in the brain. They don't express themselves in the same way, but they're still present, and there are different mechanisms involved. Now, there's some hysteresis phenomena. Sometimes you can't come back. There's some ambiguous figures. You don't really understand what they are, and people tell you that's a line, that's this and that and the other. And then you can see those figures, and you can only see the line in these figures because something triggered that understanding in your brain. That applies to simple visual perceptions, but also other types of perceptions and perspectives that occur. I'm sure we could continue on and on because the brain is such a fascinating subject matter. Maybe one question and then we'll call it a day. Hello. Now, my question brings us back to the previous one. Now, you worked on MRIs, neuroimaging, where you can see certain areas, where you feel pain, compassion. Now, a very experienced meditator, somebody who understands his state of mind, if you take as a starting point the image of that person's brain, would you say that visually there's something different from an ordinary image? Well, let me make sure I understood your question correctly. In psychology, we talk about traits, sustainable invariance that you can measure at rest to characterize the meditation experience. Is that what you mean? It could be that, yes. Now, when we talk about spirituality, we talk about awakened persons or bodies. If you take an image of the brain, when you look at it, is it a different image from that of an ordinary person, somebody who doesn't meditate? Now, in this study with Gaël, we try to focus on this. You have to look at the brain at rest. There's outstanding literature on this that tries to understand the way in which the brain is functionally connected at rest. So you do a scan, person closes their eyes, doesn't do anything. Many studies today have tried to show how the different areas of the brain will couple up with each other. That reflects the intrinsic functional organization of the brain. And we know in psychiatry, for instance, that people who are depressed, anxious, schizophrenics will have a functional organization of their brain at rest that will be different and that you can characterize precisely. Amongst meditation researchers, there's a hypothesis now there would be a neuronal signature of this meditation experience that has been cultivated, of this way of being, that may leave a trace on the way in which the brain functions at rest. And some studies have managed to show in neuroimaging that there is something different. But there's something different in other networks. As I said, we haven't got enough data. In Lyon and Nantes, we have a database with some 60 meditator participants, non-meditators, and we focused on the images of the brain at rest. Now, in the same way, does that mean that you would observe a difference if you focused on images of the brain in action? Now, when I say this, the order we give to the person is that the person relaxes and is at rest, and we tell them just let go and rest. But the brain is always active, it never really stops, and the way in which it'll couple up and in which it'll establish connections will show there are certain risk factors or not. So it is maybe an indication of contemplative practices. A last question, but this is a complex question. When you measure these differences between an ordinary person and somebody who's a well-experienced meditator, you may see there's something different. This famous signature, does that mean it is due to intense meditation practice, or is it another experience that led these persons to do something for a long time? So it is interesting to focus on these longitudinal studies where you take novices, where you try and see if this causal link exists or not. You try and explain this scientifically. It is science after all. These are working hypotheses, as Gaël said. They're then upheld by longitudinal studies. Thank you. A final question, very quickly. I'm a young mother. I've had a baby 6 months ago. I've been breastfeeding ever since. I know how good breastfeeding is. Perla, do you think that if I started meditating more than I do at the moment, I would be able to pass that on to my child through breastfeeding? In the fetus, you can pass on certain things to the fetus. What about meditation? In other words, could meditation be passed on to your children through meditation, through breastfeeding? Sorry. No, it's not just meditation that you can pass on. It's your lifestyle, it's the way you live. That has an influence on your biology. A lot of molecules are passed to the baby through your milk when you breastfeed. It is molecules produced by your cells, but also microbiotic cells. We have a lot of knowledge about this today. What you can do to improve your well-being will, of course, have an impact on the well-being of your baby, of your child. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Thank you very much for your questions, for your answers, for your participation. I think that Elizabeth will join us now. Can Luc, would Luc like to take the floor? André Malraux, culture minister, said that the 21st century would be spiritual or would not be. A famous quote.